In my mind, there are a few different ways to categorize crossovers. To begin with, we can do so by purpose. There is the meets crossover and the versus crossover. Meets is fairly standard. It's born from the simple desire to explore what would happen if these characters were to meet and interact. Versus, meanwhile, is predicated entirely on the idea of the involved parties being pitted against each other in combat. Fights can still occur in a meets crossover, but that's generally a natural result of the clashing personalities of the characters, whereas a versus crossover will intentionally craft a scenario to lead into a physical clash, which can often feel contrived. Obviously, I much prefer the former. An example of a meets crossover that results in a fight is Batman/Judge Dredd Judgment on Gotham. An example of a versus crossover is basically any that has versus in the title, or V if you hold nothing but contempt for the characters involved. Another way to categorize crossovers, usually the versus kind, is by how the characters are divided for the conflicts to come. There are brand versus brand and good versus evil. It's fairly self-explanatory, but brand versus brand divides the characters based on their home IPs, while good versus evil divides the characters based on their moral alignments. Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe is an example of the former, while Marvel vs Capcom Infinite is the latter. There are actually two other options, one versus all where it's every man for himself, and all versus one where everyone comes together regardless of brand or alignment to oppose the final antagonist, a la Super Smash Bros. Brawl's climax and the entirety of Smash Ultimate. But that's usually reserved for the climax, and I'd like to focus on the pros and cons of the other two approaches as showcased by the two aforementioned games in their cinematic story modes. Both stories have the same basic premise. A big bad from each IP gets merged into a new antagonist who sets the merger of both universes into motion, resulting in heroes and villains from both universes getting caught up in this conflict. The difference is that the MK heroes and villains unite to fight the DC heroes and villains, while the Marvel and Capcom heroes unite to defeat an alliance of their respective foes. I'm going to steal a bit from a friend of mine to discuss the pros and cons of these two approaches in the context of a fighting game story mode. Pro! MVCI goes for the MCU style of funny banter, which is ideal for a crossover story. You get fun interactions between the characters even if it's quite cringy and lost in translation at times. It's undeniably fun to see Dante and Hawkeye's Legolas and Gimli style kill contest, or Morrigan hitting on Ghost Rider who is having none of it. And there are even some non-comedic interactions, like how Ryu has apparently been helping Hulk to control his rage since that's something he himself has to deal with. For me, a crossover where two characters just sit down and talk is way more interesting than one where they put their personalities aside and just pit their movesets against each other. It's why I dislike Death Battle so much. God! Because the cast is divided by alignment here, the enemy roster is pathetically small. After all, you want to represent as many franchises from each side as possible, right? So if you're only going to have one Devil May Cry rep, it's going to be Dante, not Virgil. If you have one Thor rep, it's Thor, not Loki. As a result, while you have a wide range of playable heroes, the fights are mostly against generic Ultron bots until you reach one of a handful of proper villains you only see once, making the game feel like it would work better as an Ultimate Alliance style action game rather than a fighting game. The only real variety comes in fights with other heroes brought about by disagreements, misunderstandings, or just mind control. Now, onto MKvsDCU. Pro! The cast being divided by IP means that nobody's placed into an unfightable hero category. Everybody's fought 2 to 4 times aside from boss characters, and poor Scorpion, giving us pretty much optimal variety when it comes to gameplay. Sure, we don't get to play as everyone here either, thanks to Midway/NetherRealm's rigid story structure, but we do get to play as the major villains, which is not the case in MVCI. God! However, keeping the characters locked to just their IP means we don't get the cool team-up moments and fun banter MVC offers, with most interactions being antagonistic in nature. We don't break from this style until the very last fight of the story, where Raiden and Superman finally realise they aren't enemies and start working together. While it was novel to see Shang Tsung or Kano working with their longtime nemesis, this was less noteworthy on the DC side and left the game feeling like a wasted opportunity. In summary, good vs evil gives us really good interactions between the two IPs, but the gameplay side suffers due to lack of variety unless you let the villains win some fights, while brand vs brand has much more variety in its opponents, but with crossover interactions limited to fairly generic antagonism that is often artificially enforced. So what can we learn from these two games? How should these story modes be approached in future fighting game crossovers like the enigmatic Tekken Cross Street Fighter or the seemingly inevitable DOA vs KOF? Well, sticking to just one style is a mistake. Doing so sacrifices variety of either matchups or interactions. I'd say the best approach is to go primarily brand versus brand for the first act, as the characters stick with the enemy they know and clash with the other IP's characters. At the end of this act, the villainous alliance is formed or exposed, and we switch to good versus evil, possibly switching into all versus one for the climax, where the main villain tries to dispose of his underlings, who then join the heroes to oppose him. MVCI probably would have been like this had they not, skipped the first act where everyone meets for the first time, which is easily the most interesting and enjoyable part of most crossovers, and instead launched right into the start of the second act. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended content is Chris Gildart's pros vs cons videos on Warriors Autochief for Muso Mei. I have to shill him because he's going to come after me if I steal his bit without pointing people to his content. I'm serious, he's immersed in the conflict of time-displaced Chinese and Japanese warriors and he's going to come after me like Lu Bu if I don't. Send help, please.